In the autumn of 1924, Gary, Indiana stood as a monument to American industrial ambition, its steel mills belching smoke into skies that rarely knew the color of blue. The city, barely 2 decades old, had grown like a cancer around the shores of Lake Michigan. Its streets laid out in rigid geometric patterns that mirrored the mechanized precision of the factories that gave it life. Among the endless rows of company housing and immigrant tenements, one structure stood apart. A Victorian mansion at 1247 Monroe Street, its Gothic revival architecture a relic from an earlier, more genteel time. The house had been built in 1903 by Cornelius Whitmore, a steel magnate whose fortune had been forged in the furnaces of what would become U.S. Steel. Whitmore had commissioned the finest craftsmen from Chicago to create his lakeside retreat, complete with imported Italian marble, hand-carved mahogany, and stained glass windows that cast rainbow shadows across polished floors. The mansion's tower room offered panoramic views of the lake, while its basement stretched deep into the sandy soil, reinforced with steel beams that Whitmore had personally selected from his own mills. By 1924, however, Cornelius Whitmore had been dead for 3 years, and his widow, Eleanor, had reluctantly agreed to rent the property to the Kowalski family, Polish immigrants who had arrived in Gary seeking the promise of steady work and the American dream. Stefan Kowalski, a shift supervisor at the Indiana Harbor Works, had saved for 5 years to afford the monthly rent of $45, a sum that would allow his family to escape the cramped quarters of the company boarding house where they had lived since arriving from Krakow. The Kowalski family consisted of Stefan and his wife Maria, their 3 children, Stanisław, age 14, Anna, 12, and little Józef, barely 8 years old, and Maria's elderly mother, Babcia Katarzyna, whose weathered hands bore the scars of decades spent working in the textile mills of the old country. They moved into the Whitmore mansion on September 3, 1924, their few possessions looking almost comically small in the grand foyer with its crystal chandelier and sweeping staircase. What the Kowalskis could not have known as they arranged their meager furniture in rooms designed for opulence was that the house on Monroe Street had stood empty for nearly 2 years, not due to the economic downturn that had affected much of the Midwest, but because of a series of incidents that had driven away 3 previous tenants in rapid succession. The Gary Tribune had reported these departures as routine lease terminations, but the whispered conversations in the Polish neighborhoods told a different story. One of doors that opened by themselves, of children's voices echoing through empty rooms, and of an overwhelming sense that something within those walls was watching, waiting, and growing stronger with each passing day. The first weeks in the Whitmore mansion passed with the deceptive calm of a gathering storm, the family settling into routines that seemed almost normal despite the house's imposing grandeur. Stefan would depart each morning at 5:30 for his shift at the steel works, his lunch pail clanking against his hip as he walked the 1.5 miles through streets still shrouded in the pre-dawn darkness. Maria busied herself with the enormous task of maintaining a house nearly 10 times the size of their previous dwelling, her footsteps echoing through rooms that seemed to swallow sound and light with equal hunger. The children adapted with the resilience of youth, though each in their own peculiar way. Stanisław, already showing signs of the brooding temperament that would mark his transition into manhood, claimed the tower room as his private domain, spending hours gazing out at the steel mills, whose orange glow painted the night sky in shades of hellfire. Anna, ever the dutiful daughter, helped her mother with household chores while secretly exploring the mansion's numerous closets and hidden alcoves, her curiosity as sharp as the pins her grandmother used for her endless mending. Young Józef, perhaps the most adaptable of the children, seemed to find friends in every shadow, chattering to invisible companions with the unself-conscious joy of childhood. It was Babcia Katarzyna, who first noticed the peculiarities that would later consume the family's waking thoughts and haunt their dreams. The old woman, whose superstitions had been forged in the remote villages of Galicia, observed that certain rooms in the house remained perpetually cold, despite the modern steam heating system that Stefan had proudly demonstrated upon their arrival. She noted how the servants' bells in the kitchen would ring at odd hours, their brass tongues moving without human intervention, and how the grandfather clock in the main hallway would sometimes chime 13 times at midnight, its mechanical voice seeming to mock the very concept of measured time. The basement proved particularly troublesome, its stone walls weeping with a moisture that defied the house's elevated position and excellent drainage. Maria had attempted to use the space for storage, but found that anything left there for more than a few days would become covered in a thin film of what appeared to be ash, despite the absence of any fireplace or furnace in that section of the house. The air itself seemed thick and oppressive, carrying a metallic taste that reminded Babcia Katarzyna of the blood-soaked battlefields of her youth, when the Austrian army had marched through her village, leaving only widows and orphans in their wake. By the third week of September, the family had established an unspoken agreement to avoid certain areas of the house after sunset: the basement, naturally, but also the morning room where Eleanor Whitmore's portrait hung above an ornate fireplace, her painted eyes seeming to track movement across the space with an intensity that made even Stefan uncomfortable. The children had developed their own coping mechanisms. Stanisław would play his harmonica in the tower room, the melancholy Polish folk songs, seeming to provide some measure of protection against the encroaching darkness. Anna would recite her prayers in Latin, the ancient words creating a barrier of faith around her small bed, and Józef would simply disappear for hours at a time, returning with stories of games played with children whose names he could never quite remember and whose faces seemed to fade from his memory even as he spoke of them. October arrived with an unseasonable warmth that hung over Gary like a fever, the steel mills working overtime to meet the demands of a recovering economy, while the residents of Monroe Street found themselves trapped in an atmosphere that seemed to press against their skin with invisible hands. The Kowalski family had begun to notice discrepancies in their daily routines. Small things at first, easily dismissed as the product of distraction or fatigue, but gradually accumulating into a pattern that defied rational explanation. Maria discovered that meals she had prepared would vanish from the kitchen table during the brief moments she stepped away to gather the family, leaving behind only the faintest trace of warmth on the china plates and a lingering aroma that seemed to mock her efforts at maintaining normalcy. The icebox, that modern marvel that Stefan had been so proud to demonstrate to his neighbors, would be found standing open in the mornings despite being securely closed the night before, its contents rearranged in configurations that suggested deliberate intent rather than random disturbance. The children's school supplies began disappearing with alarming regularity. Pencils, notebooks, and textbooks would vanish from their designated places only to reappear days later in impossible locations. Anna's arithmetic book was found in the basement coal bin, its pages somehow remaining pristine despite the surrounding dust and debris. Stanisław's fountain pen materialized inside the grandfather clock's case, its ink still wet despite having been missing for nearly a week. And Józef's slate was discovered balanced precariously on the chandelier in the main foyer, positioned so perfectly that it could not have fallen there by accident. Stefan, a practical man whose faith in logic had been forged in the mechanical precision of the steel mills, attempted to rationalize these incidents by suggesting that the family was simply adjusting to the house's unusual layout and that their possessions were being misplaced in the confusion of occupying such a large space. However, his explanations grew increasingly strained as the phenomena intensified, particularly when he discovered that his own tools, instruments of precision that he treated with the reverence of a priest handling sacred relics, were being moved from his basement workshop to locations throughout the house, sometimes arranged in patterns that seemed to spell out words in an alphabet he could not decipher. Babcia Katarzyna, whose years had taught her to trust instinct over logic, began to keep a detailed record of these incidents in a small leather journal that she carried in her apron pocket. Her observations, written in a mixture of Polish and broken English, documented not only the movement of objects, but also subtle changes in the house's atmosphere, temperatures that fluctuated without regard to the heating system, shadows that lingered in corners where no obstacles should have cast them, and sounds, always sounds, that seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves. The old woman's entries grew increasingly urgent as October progressed, her handwriting becoming more erratic as she struggled to capture experiences that existed at the very boundaries of human comprehension. The family's sleep patterns began to deteriorate as the incidents multiplied, each member finding themselves wakeful during the small hours of the morning when the boundary between the material world and something far more ancient seemed to grow thin. They would lie in their beds, listening to footsteps in the hallways, doors opening and closing, and what sounded disturbingly like children's laughter echoing through rooms they knew to be empty, while outside the steel mills continued their ceaseless production, their mechanical rhythms providing a constant reminder that the world beyond their walls continued to function according to the immutable laws of industry and progress. As October gave way to November, the disturbances within the Whitmore mansion escalated beyond mere displacement of objects into something far more psychologically corrosive, a systematic erosion of the family's sense of reality that began to manifest in ways that challenged their most fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence itself. The house seemed to be learning from their routines, adapting its manifestations to exploit their individual vulnerabilities with a precision that suggested not random supernatural activity, but deliberate, malevolent intelligence. Stanisław, whose adolescent mind was already struggling with the turbulent transition from childhood to manhood, found himself the target of phenomena that seemed designed to undermine his emerging sense of identity and purpose. His harmonica, the one constant that had connected him to his cultural heritage and provided solace during the family's difficult adjustment to American life, began producing sounds that bore no relationship to his fingering or breath control, mournful dirges in minor keys that seemed to emanate from within the instrument itself, melodies that spoke of loss and abandonment with a sophistication that exceeded his limited musical education. Maria's domestic sphere, the foundation upon which she had built her identity as wife and mother, became the site of increasingly elaborate disruptions that transformed her daily routines into exercises in psychological endurance. The kitchen, once her sanctuary, developed an atmosphere of latent hostility. Pots would boil over despite careful attention, bread would refuse to rise even with fresh yeast, and the modern gas stove would ignite burners without human intervention, filling the room with the acrid smell of burning gas and the ever-present threat of explosion or fire. Anna, whose devotion to her Catholic faith had provided structure and meaning throughout the family's immigration and adjustment, discovered that her religious observances were being systematically corrupted by forces that seemed to understand precisely how to weaponize her spiritual beliefs against her psychological well-being. Her rosary beads would be found arranged in blasphemous patterns on her bedroom floor. Her prayer book would fall open to passages describing divine wrath and abandonment, and the small crucifix above her bed would be discovered hanging upside down each morning, despite her careful attention to restoring it to its proper position the night before. Young Józef's invisible companions, initially dismissed as the product of childhood imagination, adjusting to an unfamiliar environment, began to exhibit characteristics that suggested something far more troubling than mere fantasy. The boy would engage in elaborate conversations with entities he claimed could provide detailed information about the house's history, its previous occupants, and events that had occurred within its walls decades before the Kowalski family's arrival. Information that proved disturbingly accurate when Stefan discreetly investigated Joseph's claims through conversations with longtime Gary residents and research in the city's nascent historical records. Stefan himself, the family's anchor of rationality and practical problem-solving, found his authority as patriarch being systematically undermined by phenomena that challenged his most basic understanding of cause and effect. His engineering training, which had served him well in the logical world of steel production and mechanical systems, proved utterly inadequate when confronted with a reality that seemed to operate according to rules that predated scientific method by centuries. The man, who had once taken pride in his ability to fix any mechanical problem, found himself helpless against a house that appeared to be actively working to drive his family towards some unspecified but undoubtedly tragic conclusion. While outside, the familiar sounds of industrial progress continued their relentless rhythm, indifferent to the domestic horror unfolding within the Gothic walls of 1247 Monroe Street. December arrived with a bitter cold that seemed to penetrate not merely through the mansion's windows and walls, but into the very souls of its occupants, carrying with it an intensity of psychological pressure that transformed the grand house from a symbol of upward mobility into something resembling a beautifully appointed prison. The heating system, despite Stefan's increasingly desperate attempts at maintenance and repair, proved incapable of warming certain rooms that remained perpetually cold, their temperatures dropping to levels that made breath visible and caused frost to form on interior surfaces, despite the modern radiators that lined their walls. The family's attempts to maintain normal routines became exercises in futility, as the house seemed to actively resist their efforts at establishing any sense of predictability or control. Babcia Katarzyna's morning ritual of preparing coffee in the kitchen became a daily confrontation with forces that would extinguish the gas burners, spoil fresh milk overnight, and cause her carefully maintained coffee grinder to produce grounds that tasted of ash and metal, rather than the rich Brazilian beans that Stefan brought home from the company store each week. The children's education suffered as their school books and supplies continued to disappear and reappear in configurations that seemed designed to mock their efforts at learning and advancement. Anna's mathematics homework would be found completed in handwriting that resembled her own, but contained answers to problems she had never seen, worked out in methods she did not understand, while Stanisław's English compositions would be discovered rewritten in archaic language that spoke of themes far too sophisticated and disturbing for a 14-year-old mind to have conceived independently. The basement workshop that Stefan had established as his refuge from the house's increasingly oppressive atmosphere became the site of phenomena that challenged his most fundamental beliefs about the physical world and his place within it. His carefully organized tools would be found arranged in patterns that resembled architectural blueprints for structures that had never been built, their measurements corresponding to no known system of construction, but possessing an internal logic that suggested profound geometric knowledge. The workbench itself would be discovered each morning bearing intricate carvings that had not been there the previous evening, symbols and figures that seemed to tell a story of industrial ambition corrupted by forces that predated human understanding of metal and fire. Maria's once proud management of the household became a daily battle against an environment that seemed determined to reduce her to despair through the systematic corruption of every domestic task she attempted to perform. Laundry would emerge from the washing machine stained with substances that defied identification. Meals would spoil within hours of preparation despite being stored in the modern refrigerator. and her careful cleaning of the mansion's numerous rooms would be undone overnight by accumulations of dust and debris that appeared to generate spontaneously from within the walls themselves. The woman who had once taken pride in maintaining a spotless home found herself living in an environment that actively resisted her efforts, transforming her domestic skills into sources of frustration and failure rather than accomplishment and purpose. As Christmas approached, the family found themselves increasingly isolated, not only from their neighbors and the broader Gary community, but from each other, each member retreating into private worlds of coping mechanisms that proved inadequate against the house's relentless psychological assault. The sounds of children's laughter that had once seemed merely mysterious now carried undertones of mockery and malice, while the mechanical rhythms of the steel mills outside provided a constant reminder that the normal world continued to function according to predictable laws of physics and engineering, indifferent to the domestic nightmare unfolding within the Gothic walls of what had once been Cornelius Whitmore's pride and testament to American industrial achievement. The first weeks of 1925 brought with them a realization that would transform the Kowalski family's understanding of their situation from temporary hardship to something approaching genuine existential crisis. They had become unable to leave the house on Monroe Street, not due to financial constraints or practical considerations, but because of a phenomenon that defied rational explanation and challenged their most basic assumptions about free will and human agency. Stefan's attempts to secure alternative housing had been systematically sabotaged by circumstances that seemed to align with supernatural precision. Landlords would change their minds after initial agreements, available properties would be rented to other tenants within hours of the Kowalskis' inquiries, and their savings account at the Gary National Bank would show unexplained withdrawals that left them without the deposits necessary to secure new accommodations. The children's efforts to spend time away from the house proved equally futile, as their friendships with neighborhood children began to deteriorate under the influence of circumstances that seemed designed to isolate them from normal social connections. Anna's closest friend, Mary Kowalski, whose family lived 3 blocks away in a modest company house, began experiencing nightmares after visiting the mansion that were so severe her parents forbade further contact with the family. Stanisław found that his attempts to find work after school hours were thwarted by a series of incidents at potential job sites, equipment malfunctions, minor accidents, and personality conflicts with supervisors that seemed to occur with such regularity that his reputation among Gary's Polish business community became permanently damaged. Józef's relationship with his invisible companions had evolved into something that caused even greater concern among family members. As the boy began to exhibit knowledge of events and circumstances that extended far beyond his limited life experience or educational background. He would speak with casual familiarity about the construction of the steel mills, the immigration patterns of various ethnic groups, and the political machinations that had shaped Gary's development. Information that he claimed to have learned from his special friends who had been in the house much longer than the Kowalski family and who seemed eager to share their accumulated wisdom with anyone willing to listen. Babcia Katarzyna's journal entries from this period, discovered decades later during the house's eventual demolition, reveal the full extent of the family's psychological deterioration and their growing awareness that they had become prisoners within what appeared to be an elaborate supernatural snare. Her handwriting, once careful and deliberate despite her limited formal education, had become increasingly erratic, with entries that mixed Polish folk remedies and Catholic prayers with desperate attempts to document phenomena that seemed to exceed the boundaries of human language and comprehension. The old woman's observations during January and February of 1925 describe a house that had become actively malevolent in its treatment of its occupants. no longer content with mere mischief or mysterious incidents, but engaged in a systematic campaign designed to break down their individual and collective resistance to forces that seemed to require their presence for purposes that remained maddeningly unclear. Windows would refuse to open despite Stefan's mechanical expertise. Doors would jam when family members attempted to leave for work or school. And the telephone that connected them to the outside world would produce only static and strange voices speaking in languages that none of them recognized, but that seemed to carry messages of warning or perhaps invitation to surrender to circumstances beyond their control. The winter of 1925 transformed the Whitmore mansion from a temporary home into something resembling a beautifully appointed laboratory where forces that predated human industrial civilization conducted experiments on a Polish immigrant family whose only crime had been the pursuit of economic advancement and the American dream. While outside, the steel mills continued their relentless production, their smokestacks visible from the tower room windows, serving as constant reminders of a world that operated according to comprehensible laws of physics and human ambition, utterly indifferent to the domestic horror unfolding within sight of their orange flames and mechanical precision. Spring's arrival in 1925 brought with it not the renewal and hope typically associated with the season's return, but rather an intensification of the phenomena that had trapped the Kowalski family within the increasingly malevolent environment of 1247 Monroe Street, as if the warming weather had awakened something that had been merely dormant during the harsh winter months rather than absent or defeated. The house began to exhibit characteristics that suggested not merely supernatural activity, but something approaching conscious intelligence, its manifestations becoming more sophisticated and psychologically targeted with each passing day. Stefan's workshop in the basement became the site of what can only be described as impossible construction projects that appeared to complete themselves during the night hours when the family huddled together in the upper floors, trying to find safety in numbers and proximity. His tools would be found each morning arranged in precise configurations around partially completed mechanical devices that bore no resemblance to any industrial equipment he had encountered during his years at the steelworks, yet possessed an internal logic and engineering sophistication that seemed to exceed current technological capabilities by decades or perhaps centuries. Maria's kitchen transformed into a theater of culinary impossibilities, where meals would prepare themselves according to recipes that existed in no cookbook she had ever seen, utilizing ingredients that appeared spontaneously in her carefully maintained pantry, despite her increasing reluctance to venture beyond the house's threshold for grocery shopping. The aromas that emanated from these mysterious cooking sessions carried hints of spices and preparations that seemed to belong to culinary traditions from regions she could not identify, yet possessed a familiarity that suggested deep cultural memories or perhaps ancestral knowledge that had been awakened by the house's influence. The children's bedrooms became staging areas for educational experiences that exceeded the boundaries of their formal schooling by vast margins, as their textbooks would be found rewritten overnight with information that seemed to anticipate scientific and historical developments that had not yet occurred. Anna's geography book contained detailed maps of cities that did not exist and countries whose names appeared in no atlas, while Stanisław's literature anthology included poems and stories written in perfect English but attributed to authors whose names appeared in no library catalogue or literary history. Babcia Katarzyna's journal entries from this period describe phenomena that challenged not only her understanding of the physical world, but her deeply held religious beliefs about the nature of existence itself. She wrote of discovering rooms within the house that had not been there the previous day, chambers whose architecture seemed to follow principles that predated European construction techniques while incorporating design elements that would not be invented for decades. These spaces contained furniture and decorations that appeared to be simultaneously ancient and futuristic, crafted from materials that felt familiar to the touch yet could not be identified or categorized according to any known system of classification. The family's attempts to document their experiences for potential future investigation or legal testimony became exercises in frustration as cameras would malfunction when aimed at the most significant phenomena. The family's attempts to document their experiences for potential future investigation or legal testimony became exercises in frustration as cameras would malfunction when aimed at the most significant phenomena. The Kowalski family found themselves living within a reality that seemed designed to resist documentation or external verification. Isolated not only physically within the confines of the Whitmore mansion, but epistemologically within an experience that could not be shared or validated by the broader community of Gary Dyer's Indiana, whose residents continued their daily routines of industrial labor and immigrant aspiration, unaware that within sight of their modest homes and familiar steel mills, 5 human beings had become subjects in an experiment whose parameters and objectives remained as mysterious as the forces that had initiated it nearly 8 months earlier. The summer of 1925 brought with it a resolution to the Kowalski family's ordeal that was as sudden as it was disturbing. Though the precise nature of that resolution remains a matter of considerable debate among the few researchers who have investigated the case in the decades since its occurrence. On July 15th, exactly 10 months and 12 days after their initial occupancy of the Whitmore mansion, the family simply vanished, leaving behind a house that showed no signs of struggle or violence, but rather appeared to have been carefully prepared for their departure by hands other than their own. Stefan's foreman at the Indiana Harbor Works reported that he had failed to appear for his shift on the morning of July 16th, a breach of routine so unprecedented that management immediately contacted the Gary Police Department to request a welfare check at the Monroe Street address. Officers Thomas McKenna and Joseph Kowalski, the latter himself a Polish immigrant who had known the family through the tight-knit community networks that connected Gary's Eastern European population, discovered the front door standing open and the interior of the house arranged with an orderliness that seemed almost ceremonial in its precision. The family's personal belongings remained in their designated locations throughout the house, but arranged in patterns that suggested preparation for a journey rather than abandonment or flight. Suitcases had been packed with methodical care, containing not only clothing and personal items, but also photographs, documents, and mementos that told the story of their immigration experience and their brief time in the Steel City. Babcia Katarzyna's journal was found on the kitchen table, open to a final entry dated July 14th that consisted of a single line written in Polish. "We understand now what the house has been trying to teach us." The basement workshop revealed the most puzzling evidence of the family's final hours, as Stefan's tools had been arranged in a configuration that formed what appeared to be a complex geometric pattern extending across the entire floor space, with each instrument positioned with mathematical precision that would have required surveying equipment and advanced knowledge of architectural principles. At the center of this pattern lay a single sheet of paper bearing technical drawings for what appeared to be a mechanical device of unprecedented sophistication, accompanied by notes written in Stefan's handwriting, but utilizing engineering terminology and concepts that would not be developed by mainstream science for several decades. Local authorities conducted a thorough investigation that extended throughout the summer and into the autumn months, interviewing neighbors, co-workers, and members of Gary's Polish community, but found no evidence of foul play or any indication that the family had been planning to relocate to another city or return to Poland. The Kowalski family's bank account remained untouched, their belongings undisturbed, and their social connections intact, yet they had disappeared as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only questions and the gradually fading memory of 5 human beings who had briefly inhabited a house that seemed to possess its own agenda for the lives of those who dwelt within its walls. The Whitmore mansion remained vacant for the remainder of 1925 and throughout 1926, its windows boarded shut and its rooms gradually accumulating the dust and neglect that eventually claim all abandoned structures. While outside, the steel mills continued their eternal production, their orange flames, visible from the tower room windows, serving as a constant reminder that the industrial world continued to function according to the predictable laws of physics and human ambition. In 1927, the house was purchased by a demolition company and razed to make way for a small park that still exists today. Though local residents have noted that the ground where the mansion once stood remains perpetually barren, refusing to support the growth of grass or flowers, despite numerous attempts at landscaping and the application of fertilizers and soil amendments that proved successful elsewhere in the neighborhood. The fate of the Kowalski family remains unknown, though occasional reports surface of 5 individuals matching their descriptions being cited in various American cities during the decades following their disappearance. Always together, always appearing exactly as they had in 1925, and always associated with houses or buildings that developed reputations for supernatural activity shortly after their brief residence. Whether these sightings represent the actual Kowalski family, or merely the wishful thinking of people seeking closure for an unsolved mystery, remains a matter of speculation. But the mathematical precision of their disappearance and the careful arrangement of evidence they left behind suggests that their departure from Gary, Indiana, was neither random nor involuntary, but rather the culmination of a process that had been building throughout their 10-month residence, in a house that had taught them something about the nature of reality that the rest of us have yet to understand.